So I don't have any free t-shirts or anything to give away, but I've got a great guest here, Jack Cable. Before I introduce him, just a little bit about myself. I'm, as Ed said, an AVP in our cybersecurity organization. I have a lot of responsibilities, one of which is enforceable governance, and we're going to talk about secure by design here today. And then Jack Cable, we're going to get into your background here in a second, but CEO and co-founder of Corridor, congrats on the Series A from yesterday. And formerly helped shape national strategy for cybersecurity with CISA. And also has a fascinating backstory going back to when you were in high school. So we're going to get into that. But the main point of today is we're going to be talking about secure by design. So as software, and specifically AI software, becomes more and more central to our lives, securing it from the start is crucial. And it's not just a buzzword, secure by design. It's actually a crucial need in the industry. So we're going to unpack what that means in practice a little bit and why insecure products are still so prevalent in the market, and what we can do as practitioners, vendors, and customers to influence a change in that. Finally, we're going to get into some actionable steps for each of your different roles, hopefully. And then we'll have time for Q&A. And the whole point of this is to help everyone raise their game and increase the level of security in your organizations. So Jack, before we dive in, I want to talk about your background. So first of all, welcome, and thank you for being here. Can you just talk about your background and how you started in cybersecurity a little bit?
Definitely. Well, first of all, thank you so much, Dan, AT&T, for having me, everyone here for coming. So to share a bit about my background, I've always had this curiosity to go and really understand how systems work. I started coding in middle school, and when I was 15, stumbled across a vulnerability in a cryptocurrency website where I noticed I was able to send a negative amount of money to other people on the site, so to actually steal money from their accounts. And fortunately, I saw that they had a bug bounty program. So, they would pay hackers like myself to go and tell them about vulnerabilities in their product. So I was able to report it to them. They paid me for it. And that really started my interest in security. Taught myself more about security, did more bug bounties, eventually got into the top 100 rank of hackers of all time on HackerOne.
Wow. And
through the course of that, actually got invited to some of the Pentagon's bug bounties. So started doing that in high school, eventually won the Hack the Air Force competition, and then went to work for the Pentagon after high school. So kind of had this introduction to security, did a lot of hands-on security research, but over time got involved in some kind of broader policy strategy work as well. And that eventually led me to work both in the Senate as well as at CISA, Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, leading on the Secure by Design initiative and really pushing technology vendors to prioritize their product security. So really excited to dive into that today. And most recently, as you mentioned, I started my own company called Corridor, and we're building the security layer for AI coding, making sure that as companies are adopting all of these really fantastic tools to allow engineers to work significantly faster than ever before, that they can do that securely. So excited to dive into this.
That's awesome. So congrats on the top 100 of all time.
Thank you.
As a trivia question, can you name the other 99?
I can name a couple. I don't know about all 100 of them.
So I spent high school differently than that. We won't get into that. But just if you could give me two examples. Like your first one's really interesting. But like, what was the most challenging of the bug bounties that you disclosed? And then on the flip side of that, if you were just to pick any bug bounty program in the world, give me some ideas of where you're confident you would be able to find something that's reportable.
Yeah. Well, what's interesting is that a lot of, often the most severe vulnerabilities really aren't all that complicated. And this is a lot of the reason why Secure by Design, as we'll talk about, is so important, right? Because there is so much of this low-hanging fruit that adversaries aren't going to do a really complicated exploit chain if they're just able to find a simple vulnerability. So a lot of the vulnerabilities I've discovered are things like insecure direct object references, which is a fancy way of saying there is some number, and if you change that, you can access someone else's data. So you'd be surprised how many websites are vulnerable to that, right? And you can access, modify sensitive data just by changing a number. So I'd say that's on the simpler side, where you can have some really consequential vulnerabilities. In terms of some of the more interesting, more complicated ones, there's some of these fun exploit chains where you're able to kind of chain together a number of different vulnerabilities. One interesting class of vulnerabilities is called server-side request forgery, where you're essentially able to force a server to make requests to some internal server, and by doing so can access various information, especially on cloud infrastructure. This can be quite severe, so I've had some vulnerability chains with that.
So your background as a researcher and a hacker, it sounds like that led you to be interested in being able to shape policy. And can you just talk about some of the things that you were able to do or led at CISA?
Yeah, exactly. So for me, what was really exciting, right, about my foray into government, and hadn't really planned on working in government, got into it somewhat accidentally, right? As I mentioned, got invited to some of the Pentagon's first bug bounties, got to know the team there, went to work there, and saw that if you're in the right place in government, right, there's a lot of potential to have high impact work. So did that both at the Pentagon and then later at CISA. And particularly with CISA, I think that was quite exciting, right, because there's this opportunity to help move entire industry. A lot of how we view software and talked about, right, is from the lens that there is a market failure in cybersecurity, right? If you think about any other industry, right, we have robust laws in place. Look at aviation or the automotive industry, or even when you buy a product, if you buy a toaster off the shelf, you can have a reasonable expectation that that product isn't going to have a defect. And if it is defective, then you can sue the manufacturer for harms resulting from that. We don't have any of that in software. And as a result, software manufacturers really aren't incentivized to build secure products. So that was what we were working on addressing at CISA, right? We drew a lot of analogies, for instance, to Ralph Nader's campaign in the 60s to make cars safer, to make sure that, right, if you got into a car, you could have a reasonable expectation that would protect you. And indeed, we've seen, right, traffic deaths plummet over the past century, and that wasn't an accident, no pun intended. It was because we made a concerted effort to improve safety. So that's really the movement that we sought to kick off at CISA.
That's great. So let's dive into this a little bit deeper. Secure by design is a term I've heard. I've been doing this for a long time, longer than you have. Been alive. And,
True.
So secure by design is, it almost has turned into a buzzword. And I was doing a little bit of research on this topic, and I think the first real published directive or paper on secure design principles goes all the way back to 1975. And so we're going to get into this a little bit more, but just in your words and maybe drawing from what you led at CISA or just what you see now, what does it really mean in practice today to have secure products and have security built into the design of those from the start? Right.
So as you mentioned, the basic idea, right, that software can, like no one is saying we can build perfectly secure software, but at the very least we can build software that's resilient to common classes of vulnerabilities, right? And to your point that this is something where we've been talking about this for decades, and yet, right, if you look at the, for instance, most commonly exploited vulnerabilities out there, they are still more often than not, quite basic, quite simple flaws. Things like memory safety issues, where we have many programming languages where you just can't introduce a memory safety vulnerability, and yet we're still seeing those dominate the, for instance, the known exploited vulnerabilities list, the top vulnerabilities that are exploited in the wild. So really what we sought out was to show that, one, that this is possible, right? It is possible to build software that is fundamentally more secure, more resilient to entire classes vulnerabilities, and doing so is both a technical problem, but arguably more so it's a business problem, right? Because we know that memory-safe languages exist. We have many case studies of companies who've adopted these and seen memory safety vulnerabilities plummet. And yet, we're still in this state of things, and that's because software companies aren't adequately prioritizing these actions of reducing classes of vulnerabilities.
Okay. I agree. There's a business problem. There's maybe an incentive problem we're going to get into a little bit later. Sorry about that. So I think, like, I'll do a poll in the room. Raise your hand if you agree that secure products are better than insecure products.
Most of the room, not everyone.
I'm actually looking for my vendors to see if anyone's not raising. So if everyone agrees, why do insecure products still dominate the marketplace?
Yeah, I think it's a couple of things, right? One, as I mentioned, there's a real lack of market incentives here. That's some of what we tried to kick off through some of the initiatives at CISA, right? But ultimately, you have to get to a point where it is affecting a software company's bottom line enough such that they want to build more secure products, right? This is something that the U.S. National Cybersecurity Strategy from a couple of years ago touched on, the fact that today, the vast majority of consequences for insecure software aren't borne by the manufacturer of that product, right? They're borne by end users, by other companies using that product. We see this through ransomware attacks, through data breaches, right? It's not affecting their bottom line. And I think a really key part of that, right, is that from a software buyer's perspective, we don't make it easy, right? I'm sure you know this. When you try to go and buy a product, you don't really have the resources to evaluate security, right? So some people call this a market for lemons, right, where buyers, there's no possible way you could have that information, right? Because that's only something right now the manufacturer of the company knows, or of the software knows, and often they don't even know themselves.
Sure.
So it's this state where we have companies who don't have the right incentives to build secure software, and their buyers don't have the right information in order to differentiate.
Right. So we saw, I'm going to go off script here a little bit, if you don't mind. A few years ago, we saw a large desire, almost a demand for vendors and software producers to produce SBOMs. Mm-hmm. And so it worked. They produced SBOMs. But then on the flip side of that, once you have all of that data in your hands, how do you actually do something with it to affect the security of the product in the future? Yep. So looking back at your time at CISA, or actually even just as a researcher, have you seen a shift in the marketplace in terms of secure products, or is it still the same problem as it has been since you started?
So I think it's going to be gradual. I think we are starting to see positive signs. For instance, at CISA, we launched the Secure by Design pledge, got commitments from over 300 companies to taking a number of concrete steps to improve their product security. And part of the pledge was to, within a year, report on what they've done. The interesting part is if you go and look, maybe 40 or 50 of these companies have actually gone and published those progress reports despite committing to. But I don't think this is necessarily a bad thing, right? Because it's the start of having more transparency here. You can see the ones who did actually follow through on it. There's some good reports out there, right? Companies who, for instance, have required multi-factor authentication among their users, seen statistics there spike up, started to roll out automatic updates. We've heard from some companies, right, that often there's folks inside the company who want to do these things, and the pledge was enough to kind of push their leadership over the line, right, and say, okay, let's actually flip the switch and roll out automatic updates, other improvements like that. So I'd say we are seeing, some gradual progress. Now, it's not as fast as I would like to be. It's not as widespread as I would like to see it, but I think we are seeing some improvements.
Let's talk about the pledge. We don't have to talk about the CISA pledge specifically, but just the concept of, hey, I promise I'm going to do better. That's great. how do we actually turn that into something that's actionable and measurable and can be reported? And what types of tactics should we as buyers or suppliers or even just the consumer customer, what kinds of things can we be doing to drive better outcomes?
Yeah, so really, right, for us, the starting point was to kind of put some of this into the public sphere, right? To get companies talking about this, making public commitments, and really then it becomes more of a reputational element, right? In the long term, I think we need more than that. I think we need more incentives, but this was a starting point. And to your point, I think a lot of how this can be continued, right, how we can make sure that this isn't just a one-time push, but there's sustained pressure on vendors is by making sure that the software buyers are asking for more. We called this secure by demand, and a good example is Pat Opet, the CISO at JP Chase, put out a letter maybe 6 months or so ago, basically articulating their point of view on this, right? And a lot of this was focused on software as a service products and some of the shortcomings they saw. Definitely recommend checking that out. I think that's exactly the type of market signal we need from companies, right? And especially is someone like JP Chase, who's a huge software buyer. Those types of signals are going to change vendors' actions. So the more that companies who are buying software products can band together and say, okay, these are the elements we really want to prioritize from our vendors, the more action we'll see.
So part of it at least is using the power of the purchasing power and turning that into requirements. Have you seen that be successful, or do you see it starting to be successful in any particular industries? You gave one example, that's a company. Is that something that industry groups or ISACs can come together on and try to change the narrative within their entire sector?
Yeah, I think we need to see more of it. So certainly something I would hope companies come together for, right? There's an interesting kind of related element of how companies articulate their security requirements today, and that's through compliance, right? Mm-hmm. And they say, okay, have these certifications in order to sell to us. And I think what I would like to see there, right, is today there's a disconnect between the enterprise security measures of a company. Do they have multi-factor authentication for their employees? Are they running, network scans? Do they have their ports closed? All of these elements, which are good practices, but these compliance frameworks rarely touch on the actual security of a product, right? And that's where I think we need to be more clear. There's some good frameworks out there, some of what we put out at CISA. There's the minimum viable secure product, open source framework out there. So I think those are the sorts of areas where I would hope to see companies starting to ask more hard questions of their vendors around.
So that's the basis of secure by demand, is just you demand better security?
Yeah, exactly. Kind of send
sense.
that market signal. And we've seen it in enterprise security. Now the focus really has to be around product security.
Okay, great. So the question I have is worded in a theoretical way, but you're here in front of a lot of practitioners and suppliers and security leaders. So you're here to advise. This is theoretical. You're not literally here to advise. But if you were, if we talk about what are the signals of maturity in a product or in a secure design process at a company, what are the top 3 or 4 things that you look for?
Yeah, a couple elements. So one, I think that you can see right away is whether they have a vulnerability disclosure policy, or even better, a bug bounty, right? So vulnerability disclosure policy is what allows security researchers like myself to report vulnerabilities to a company without fear of legal action. Bug bounty is that plus payment for that. So I think that sends a strong signal, right? Because it shows how open a company is around their security, right? Are they confident enough where they're asking the best hackers out there to poke around on their systems, to tell tell them what they're finding, because that's really the only way that you can really enable that feedback loop. So I'd say that that's one big signal, and then would also encourage folks to look at the various elements of CISA's pledge, included items around taking actions like reducing entire classes of vulnerability, reducing default passwords, some of these things that we think of as even basic practices, and yet there's many products out there today that have default passwords, that don't have automatic updates, all of these other practices that should really be the baseline for security.
Okay. Is that self-serving for you? You want them to have bug bounty programs so you can find more ways to...
Maybe mildly. Certainly, I've done a lot of work yeah.
We were talking in the green room. Just as an aside, I thought this was an interesting thing. Tell me about your favorite compensation scheme for a bug bounty program.
This is something companies should do more of. So United actually will pay out their bug bounties in miles. So I haven't really had to pay for a flight since 2017 or so. So if you're an airline out there, please,
That's pretty good.
Pay out miles.
That is pretty good. Okay, so let's split. So your company Corridor is AI focused. That's great. Most everyone in here has an AI focused product of some sort. But let's talk about this. So in this era of agentic AI and sort of what I would call the emerging amorphous security framework for AI. How does the era that we're in right now change the thinking, if it does, around secure by design principles?
So I think it certainly does, right? Because what we're seeing today is the largest scale change in, arguably the history of software, period. And I think that the most interesting area to me is, you can argue how much has AI helped in various applications. Where it very clearly has is in software development, right? Where the day-to-day life of a software developer today is entirely different from what was even 12 months ago. Now we have coding agents that you can give a task, they'll go and work for 10, 20 minutes and come back with something that isn't perfect, but it is certainly much better than even many humans could do, and allows software developers to produce 5, 10 times, maybe even more as much code. So engineers are able to work significantly faster now, and that's really great, right? A lot of exciting applications here talk about, the rise of vibe coding and the fact that really anyone now can build functional software applications. Also a bit scary from a security perspective, right? Because suddenly we have all of this new code, and it's often outpacing among the companies we're talking to their security team's ability to keep up. So really what we're focusing on at Corridor is making sure that we can enable this AI coding revolution, right, without sacrificing security, that companies can deploy coding agents and do so with confidence that they're respecting security guardrails, that the code that they're generating is more secure. So and this is an interesting development that I don't think we anticipated at CISA, right? That now that it's AI writing software, it's still the same types of vulnerabilities we want to prevent, but I think it's an exciting opportunity, right? Because we don't have to teach software developers to write more secure code. We still should, but they don't have to be the single point of failure.
Yeah, that's interesting because in a sense, the models that are now so good at producing software quickly were trained on decades of insecure software.
Exactly.
It's interesting.
Yeah, there's
that way.
benchmarks out there showing even the best models introduce vulnerabilities a double-digit percentage of the time. So there's still room to improve.
Okay, before we get to questions, thank you, by the way. Thanks for your insights. Let's talk about call to action. So if everyone in this room and online and who watches it later on YouTube, tell your friends and family, if they did one thing differently next week or tomorrow, what would move the needle the most on Secure by Design?
Yeah, so a couple things. I'd say if you are a software company, right, someone out there who's building software products, I'd say really focus on taking at least one class of vulnerability and seeing how you can eliminate that from your product, right? I talked about memory safe languages, other classes of vulnerabilities, SQL injections, for instance, right? Basic types of flaws that we've known about for decades, we've also known how to prevent at scale for decades, and we still see them pervasive within our products. So we're encouraging you to read up on Secure by Design and work on, taking some small steps at the very least to improve your product security. And then for the software buyers in the room, right, this really ties into this idea of secure by demand. Start asking these questions to your vendors, right? Asking how they are reducing entire classes of vulnerabilities from their product, asking whether they have default passwords, all of these elements, and hey, if they don't know how to answer, then maybe that's a good sign that they need to up-level their security.
It's a signal, yeah. All right, you heard the man. Tomorrow, start working on taking one class of vulnerabilities off the board. And then also, you got to keep it off the board, right?
Exactly.
All right, very good. Jack, thank you very much.
Thank
I think
you.
we're going to go to Q&A.
Yes. Yeah, perfect. I have a question here online. How early should developers be brought into secure design conversations, and what cultural or organizational blockers stand in the way?
Yeah. So I think that's something that's important, right? And it happens even before code is written, right, into the architecture of a product. So I would say that companies really ought to be thinking about, right, their threat model, how they are going to be preventing classes of vulnerabilities, ideally before they build a product. But of course, you have a lot of legacy code bases, and I think it's a continuing conversation, right, where you're looking at securing new code as it's being written or generated, but then also going into your existing code bases, seeing how well did we do, what are the steps we can take to kind of root out vulnerabilities. I think there's a lot of interesting applications of AI too, right, in order to help up-level existing code bases.
Good.
All right, are there any questions? Yeah, we have a question here in the front.
On the front.
Hi, I'm Scott Garrett with CISA Security.
Hey, Scott.
My question for you is from either Secure by Demand or is what obligation and what importance is the question to ask the software developer what percentage of your software code was generated through AI? Or what transparency should the developer have to publish it? What percentage of code was generated through AI?
Yeah, so I mean, I think we're moving to a world where nearly 100% of code will be generated at the very least with help of AI, right? So I think this is the new norm, and companies who aren't using AI to write code are going to fall behind. So I'd say it's more of a question around, what security practices are they taking when they're doing that? I for instance, don't think there is a substitute still for human code review, right? The way that we do our own software development, we use these AI tools to write a bunch of code, and then we'll go read through it, right? Make sure that's reasonable, catch any either functionality bugs, security bugs that might pop up, as well as using tools to enforce security guardrails. So I think that's what it's really about is not necessarily whether AI was used, but even with the usage of AI, how are they making sure that code is secure?
All right, one more question.
Yeah, John Dixon, Insight Global. Question for you. You mentioned the software bill of materials, and people are getting better at that, but there's not much to be able to do with it. But a lot of companies have legacy software embedded that may not have been secure by design. So tying this all together, are you seeing the use of people building agentic agents to actually go and start looking at some of that legacy, whether it's code, systems, what have you, and scanning through what's already in existence, because that's obviously a large risk area?
Yeah. So I do think that is going to be a big application of AI. There's an interesting initiative from DARPA right now called Tractor, great acronym translating all C to Rust. And it's a very ambitious project, right? They're funding companies to build open source software that leverages AI in order to translate C code to Rust, to make it so you can't have memory safety vulnerabilities. So that's one example, right, of a sort of large-scale refactor that even a couple of years ago just was completely off the table, right? Because you would have to pay humans millions and millions of dollars to do refactor. We're not quite there yet, but I think within a year or two, we'll be at a point where we can reasonably do those sorts of large-scale refactors, translations, and have both, security, other code quality benefits from it. So I think there's a lot of exciting possibilities there.
Good question. All right, Jack Cable, thank you so much. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.